Hi there. Welcome to the Oxford Energy Network seminar. Thank you very much for our in-person attendees and also those that are online. I'm David Wallam. I'm the course director for the MSc in Energy Systems. Within the energy area, our flagship course around the interdisciplinary nature of the energy transition. It's a great pleasure. So our speaker today, Holly Bailey-Burnley, was one of our students from 2021 to 2023, and has since gone into the consulting area, as many of our students do. Over the last few years, our course has really stabilised. We get about mid-30s students per year from about over 300 applicants, so it's a very competitive course. And we are also building the number of different organisations that we're working with. And that's one of the key things that we're going to hear about today from Holly's talk is, strong partnerships around the energy area that we're developing so that we can actually build up these relationships and build up the level of expertise within these domains as well. So I'm going to hand over to Holly now. Who's going to be talking about her dissertation, which was an extremely interesting one, looking at the energy impact reduction of the National Trust Conservation Area holiday cottages. So over to you, Holly.
Thanks, David. And thanks for having me. I was just saying earlier that I've found myself back here quite a bit since finishing my master's 2 years ago now, which seems like it's flown by. But yeah, I've also attended my fair share of these talks, and it's quite crazy to be on the other side and presenting rather than being the person in the audience. But yeah, as David said, today I'm going to be giving you a short overview of my master's thesis, which, as I mentioned earlier, was 2 years ago, so a bit of a disclaimer. But yeah, I wanted to keep this generally quite informal. I remember being quite tired by this time of day. Hopefully you guys aren't too tired. But yeah, again, I have reread my thesis, but if I don't remember something, I will happily share it with you. So yeah, and then I guess we'll do questions at the end.
Yes.
Yeah. Because otherwise I'm definitely going to lose my train of thought. So the title of my master's thesis was Approaching the Energy Impact Reduction of the National Trust Conservation Area Holiday Cottages. Which is quite specific and a little bit wordy, but classically, I started my research and got a little bit carried away. So I needed to make it specific enough for a master's thesis, which I think I would have quite happily turned into a PhD at the time. But yeah, so a lot of what I will talk about today has actually been based on a kind of slight burning question I had since coming to Oxford. And that was, you guys have some of the most incredible historic buildings, and notoriously a lot of smart people. So yeah, bigging you all up now. But yeah, these old buildings are characterized as being very leaky, cold, inefficient. So I'm thinking at the time something isn't quite adding up, and why has no one done anything about this? And then on the other side, I'm hearing this stuff about fabric first approach, and that we need to prioritize our thermal envelope. For example, adding insulation before adding low carbon technology like a heat pump. So now I'm quickly working out. Oh, okay. Thanks. So yeah, now I'm quickly working out maybe it's not going to be super cool to be spraying the rad can with a ton of insulation. But would that even work? And would it even be beneficial? And what would happen if you just applied a heat pump? So I had a few questions that I couldn't quite let go, so here we are. And yeah, most importantly, and I have touched on kind of smart people here already, but I can't really begin this talk without a few shout outs. So obviously David and your love for puddings, which to be honest, I didn't quite get at the beginning, but I'm now buying my own 1850s cottage. So it was transformed. Gavin Kellett, who I don't think is hearing. But Gavin and also Tina, whose papers became a bit of a Bible to me at the time, kind of exploring the complexities of historic buildings, disconnect between the building industry Brenda Boardman, who was extremely supportive to me in the beginning, especially when I had about 50 billion questions buzzing around my brain and didn't really know how to narrow it down. And then Malcolm, who critically reminded me to stop getting distracted and get on writing my thesis. And then obviously, and I can't forget this, the National Trust, who provided me with loads of data, loads of insights, and ultimately I really couldn't have completed this thesis without. So back to the talk. You'll see here I've probably already read during my blabber, but in the blue box, this pretty much sums up my conclusions, and hopefully you'll pick this up along the presentation. But this in part is a quote that's taken from the French writer and philosopher Voltaire, who said, well, actually not exactly, but said, applying a need for perfection can become the enemy of inaction. And this study highlights the imperative need for a balance, combining a detailed understanding with actionable ways forward, and ironically became a bit of self-learning for me too. So
point screen.
We begin. And yes, this looks a little bit like a thesis outline, but yeah, that was my intention. I'll start to give you a bit of background and try not to blabber on too much, and then I'll go into kind of the structure of the study, methodology, results, and a bit of discussion around them, followed by key findings and recommendations. So, bit of background. I know I mentioned the RAD cam earlier, but please erase that from your memory. Today we are going to talk about homes and holiday cottages. Domestic heat decarbonisation is one of the biggest challenges in the UK. We have the second largest ageing housing stock in Europe, and there's a lot of old buildings in Europe. 15% of UK houses are pre-1900s build, and these houses are responsible for 2.5% of UK emissions, so actually equivalent to the UK's industrial process industry, which notably actually has its own decarbonisation strategy. But historic buildings are hard to decarbonise, and that's because they're pretty, just kidding, but kind of true. Since rapid post-war reconstruction, public concern for safeguarding these properties became widespread. And as a consequence, so did efforts to preserve the country's cultural heritage. However, historic buildings built before the 1900s are categorised as traditional, comprising typically of solid walls or timber frame construction, and are absent of cavity walls, and therefore, as I mentioned earlier, are seen as leaky and cold. So they cost more to run and you can't do much about it. And at this point, David really wasn't selling the historic building club. So we land in the conservation adaptation debate and are faced with the classical energy/sustainability trilemma, with the addition of conservation on top of that. So I'm now thinking, like, how can we decarbonise these buildings then? We're kind of running out of time. On top of that, as I begin my research into historic building retrofit, the conservation experts are saying, well, no one size fits all. These buildings aren't the same as today's builds, and you can't just apply a blanket retrofit as they are all simply too different from one another. But with my tiny knowledge of human settlement and construction of buildings and villages, that statement didn't quite add up. Are you really going to be building a settlement, building a load of houses that are completely different right next to each other with different materials and done different ways? Be quite bold, perhaps innovative, but not really reality. So the burning question becomes, to what extent does this no one size fits all stand true? But to note here, this does acknowledge that this question is really treading the line between conservation and adaptation of these buildings. And this consequently became the main focus of my thesis. So the study itself, the aim of the study was to find out how the National Trust can approach reducing the energy impact of its conservation area holiday cottages in England. And by energy impact, what I really mean here is the carbon associated with its consumption and its thermal envelope. So I did this with the support of the National Trust, who may have swayed me at looking at the holiday cottages, but to be fair, they were the highest consuming assets, and they were pre-1900s build and in conservation areas. So after all of that, I was sold. I then came up with two objectives. The first one was to explore the feasibility of small-scale spatial clustering of National Trust properties for energy impact reduction. So basically to see if there are any cottages that were geographically close together and that were very similar. And then the second objective was to evaluate a sustainable mitigation pathway for the energy impact reduction of the National Trust holiday cottages. So how can we typically reduce the energy impact either by heating technology or improving the thermal envelope or by behaviour, etc. So next is the methodology. And I broke this into 4 stages. Didn't quite know about the Magic Consultant 3 at this point, but we'll stick with 4 today. So initial investigation, cluster analysis, then building energy model, and application. So the initial investigation, and this took place because to my surprise there weren't many studies out there that wanted to test the no one size fits all approach. So I thought probably best to approach with caution. And I did an initial sense check to see if this was a dumb idea or not. And on top of that, kindly received a lot of data from the National Trust on their holiday cottages and did a bit of a data tidy, began initial assessment to see where the cottages were, how many there were, and assessed at both a national, regional, and then individual scale, trying to attain enough breadth but also given the timescale that I had, so I had to obviously sit down quite a bit. But yeah, initially it was looking okay and I could go ahead with the assessment. And the next step was to analyse the cottages and group them into clusters and also see if this was possible. There were quite a few instances along this kind of thesis journey where I was thinking, okay, maybe this will work, but if it doesn't, I'm going to need to go down a different route because I really didn't know what the outcome was going to be. So the first thing I did was run a spatial cluster analysis using DB-scan, which is density-based clustering, using a minimum number of 4 cottages per cluster and at a distance of no more than about 500 meters away from each other. I then chose a case study cluster, mainly for the purposes of time. I would have loved to have done all of the buildings, but unfortunately that wasn't realistic. And I did an individual assessment of the buildings to see if their properties and if the properties and the characteristics were similar. And in fact, all of the properties within the cluster were 2-storey, single glazed, pitched roof. They had baseboard, electric heating, closed wood burners, granite walls, which was symbolic of the early granite industry in the southwest. And I'm thinking, actually, now probably my settlement knowledge isn't too bad. And I did live with an architect at the time, so that might have influenced me. So yeah, I then decided to get a better understanding of these old buildings, and I thought maybe it'd be good to build a model to get a better understanding of how their environment works as best I could. And for this, they used EnergyPlus, which to my fortune, David had persuaded another member of our cohort to use. And I think she's still using
EnergyPlus? Still using EnergyPlus.
Fantastic. So now I've got a resident expert. But yeah, at the time we were using it a little bit blindly, but we helped each other. And I managed to contact an expert in Indonesia out of pure panic who helped us through. But for those of you who haven't used EnergyPlus before, when there's an error running it, it just comes up in big red letters saying fatal error. And it's a little bit daunting the closer you get to your thesis deadline. Anyway, we made it through. So I started making a model of one of the cottages in the cluster. And there were some challenges with this. It was American software, and for some reason there was no way to make the pitch roof, and required a lot of manual inputs to consider it being a traditional build. After that, I then calibrated it to the actual energy consumption as the data from the same year used from the weather station, and miraculously it had only an 8.5% deviation, which was pretty awesome. And then I extrapolated that to the rest of the cluster and added an air source heat pump to see what the results. Right, I've got a little image here on the left which shows a snapshot of the National Trust holiday cottages in England and Wales. The cottages in the dark blue are the ones that didn't form a cluster. And then you've got the light blue dots, which are the ones that form the cluster. And you can see, and rather unsurprisingly, the most significant clusters and number of holiday cottages was in the Devon area. Now, the location might have been influenced by someone in the National Trust going, well, we're going to get a lot more money for these cottages if they're all based in Cornwall, which is likely correct because when I looked online, they were all booked up for the next 2 years and they were quite expensive. But nevertheless, more than half of the National Trust cottages formed a total of 41 clusters throughout the UK and Wales, or England and Wales, and of between 4 to 21 cottages for each cluster. We then took the case study cluster and carried out a concordance evaluation based on the similarities and characteristics within the cluster chosen. So the cluster was in the southwest. It was one of these, which has become a bit of an amalgamation here, but yeah, thought they were probably the hotspot to choose. But yeah, the cluster itself found that 68% of the characteristics of the cottages of the cluster were exactly the same, and that there was a significant variation in properties, floor area and energy consumption, indicating that not many other factors would influence the overall energy consumption. So it showed significant concordance in the cluster properties, and therefore we could apply a blanket approach to the air source heat pump across the building. So that's shown in the figure on the right. And this achieved a 30% reduction in annual energy consumption through applying an air source heat pump. So energy consumption went down despite these buildings being called leaky buildings. Now, there are loads of caveats with this, and this is by no means a perfect study. There was also a few studies that found very similar results with air source heat pump application in stone buildings. So it does present a good case study, but ultimately really needs a real life study to validate these conclusions. And this kind of leads us nicely into a quick summary. So probably revisit the question, how can the National Trust approach reducing the energy impact of its conservation area holiday cottages? The study indicates, and they really emphasize indicates, because there's still a lot of work that's needed to fully explore this concept. But the study indicates the feasibility of small-scale spatial clustering to reduce energy impact and expedite decarbonisation, challenging the no one-size-fits-all approach. The study found that more than half of the National Trust holiday cottages could form viable clusters, which are less than 500 metres apart. The study presents significant homogeneity between households within those clusters. And then application viability. So the National Trust estate managers are actually, well, or at least at the time, were divided spatially across the UK, and therefore a clustering approach could really be beneficial based on their current management structure. Ultimately, this study, well, case study, shows that there is a plausible sustainable mitigation pathway for the National Trust holiday cottages in this cluster to reduce their impact of energy consumption by 30%. The study highlights the need for constructive conservationism, which is a concept that reinforces the significance of a symbiotic relationship between heritage and adaptation to meet the needs of the present and the future, ultimately conserving the use and functioning of these buildings. So by adapting in a considerate manner, do we actually conserve the future of these properties? And then just to finish, I've put together some of my recommendations, having reread this over the weekend. There was a few bits that I wanted to highlight, but then also a continuation of the study. And it would be interesting to see if any other master's students are doing those sort of topics. But yeah, again, this study really is a mini case study. It needs a lot more work, can lead to a lot more work. And this is where hopefully, yeah, more people are interested to explore. But yeah, so the first recommendation that I had was to do a real test. I put in this slide IRL, which apparently is cool text speak. When I was here, I thought that was cool, means in real life. But yeah, doing this analysis in real life is a good way to validate the results. And yeah, see the reality of actually adding an air source heat pump, because modelling only goes so far. And the reality of installation can be very different. So I think some of Gavin's and Tina's papers actually yeah, they show the impact of poor installation of air source heat pumps, and generally buildings not being built well or well maintained to have colossal impacts on their energy consumption. The next one was kind of much broader examination of cluster testing. So the case study, only the case study in more detail, and looking at an individual level. Perhaps I could have chosen a much larger data set. Perhaps it could have been not strictly with holiday cottages and the National Trust. It would have been interesting to do this at a kind of larger scale, but unfortunately, as we know, didn't have time. And then, yeah, general continuation of themes. So another few areas that I've noticed. This felt a little bit like writing a wish list, but I wouldn't quite go as far as a Christmas list. But modelling accuracy, this was a big one, especially with U values. So I used SPAB U values for my modelling, which I think stands for something, protection of ancient buildings.
Society for the Protection of Ancient
Buildings. But yeah, they, even in their paper, they continue to state the discrepancy between measured and calculated U values and generally how inaccurate they are. And obviously that impacts a lot of people's models. The other one is air infiltration, particularly in older buildings, and actually the importance of this, but there's not a ton of studies around this, at least that I could find at the time. Maybe there's more now, I'm not sure. The other one that I picked up on was holiday mode. So I mentioned this a little bit in the paper, but there's this kind of behavioural aspect that is that I use residential behavioural assumptions. But for people going on a holiday, how you use energy, are you going to be like more blasé about leaving the heating on when you're back from a walk, and what are the impacts of that? I didn't know. I couldn't find any studies on holiday mode and the implications of that. The other one, and I think, David, this was one that you suggested a while ago, was kind of the impact on central heating systems and installing them in traditional buildings. How can you even do that? Is there an impact? Is there an opposition to installing central heating systems? There are no existing studies, so that's another cool area to look at. The embodied carbon of retrofitting historic buildings. So I mentioned earlier that I have very poor knowledge of human settlement, but they're using local materials. So if you're retrofitting using local materials, is your overall embodied carbon less than retrofitting modern buildings? Probably. And then one that I actually haven't noted here, but this was a bit burning when I was reading through this at the weekend, and that is cost. So could be a whole study in itself, really. I think because I did holiday cottages, largely the cost was consumed. But if this were to apply to houses, what is the reality of that? And would people act differently? And what would it look like? So yeah, a lot of thoughts. And I really actually enjoyed revisiting this. And I hope kind of this overview of my thesis will support others and maybe spark further research. But yeah, that's everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much.